My name is Cassandra Quill. This is Fairy Tales and Fangs, and today I want to talk to you about Spike, the Little Mermaid, and the suffering of the Soul-ful. And in this article, I am going to be highlighting Buffy episodes Becoming Part 2, Sleeper, Touched, End of Days, and Chosen, and I'll be highlighting Angel episodes, Just Rewards, and Hellbound. I had a new revelation rewatching season 7 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer that Spike's storyline almost perfectly parallels that of the Little Mermaid in the original Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. And this is excellent news for me because I love talking about Hans Christian Andersen. The original Little Mermaid story, published in 1836, differs in some pretty significant ways from the 1989 Disney movies. Importantly, in the fairy tale, mermaids live for about 300 years, but they don't have souls. Souls are reserved for humans. Chalk it up to the 19th century Christian mythos and all that. In fact, the Victorians viewed mermaids and vampires as being more similar than we do these days. Sailors feared sirens that would lull them into rocky coves and a watery grave. The Little Mermaid's own sisters enjoy linking arms and singing to sailors about the beauties of the deep. Some historians trace the mythology of snake-tailed sirens all the way back to Mesopotamian mythology by way of Lilith. In Victorian tales, mermaids were often seen as beautiful but dangerous, wild creatures at the fringes of the safe world. Spike, having been a Victorian-era poet, probably felt similarly about mermaids. Perhaps he even read and was inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's original fairy tale. The two were contemporaries after all. Like Spike, the Little Mermaid defies all odds to do the impossible and gain a soul. Like Spike, she is inspired to do so by unrequited love, but her original motivation is much deeper, and like Spike, she suffers for it. But through the suffering, she makes a choice about who she wants to be. Let's get into the once upon a time of it all. The Little Mermaid is obsessed from childhood with the surface world and the idea of having an eternal soul. She is not allowed to swim to the surface until her 15th birthday, so in the meantime, she asks her grandmother again and again to tell her about the world above the water, about the sun, about fish, which is what her grandmother calls birds, singing among the trees. The Little Mermaid even plants a garden exclusively full of red sea plants to look like the sun, which everyone else thinks is a little bit odd. When she finally turns 15, the age at which some human girls become slayers, of course, the Little Mermaid at last swims to the surface. She sees the prince celebrating his own birthday, Sweet 16, on his royal yacht. The ship sinks. The Little Mermaid rescues him, then disappears back into the sea. But now, her obsession with the surface world has really kicked into high gear. She starts to watch the prince from a distance, all the while becoming more and more fond of human beings, their ships, their paintings, the largeness of a world beyond her own. The Little Mermaid's grandmother gives her a refresher course on mermaid mortality versus human souls. If human beings are not drowned, asked the Little Mermaid, can they live forever? Do they never die, as we do here in the sea? Yes, replied the old lady, they must also die, and their term of life is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live to 300 years, but when we cease to exist here, we only become the foam on the surface of the water, and we have not even a grave down here for those we love. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever, lives after the body has been turned to dust. It rises up through the clear, pure air beyond the glittering stars. As we rise out of the water and behold all the land of the earth, so do they rise to unknown and glorious regions which we shall never see. Why have we not an immortal soul? Asked the Little Mermaid mournfully. I would give gladly all the hundreds of years that I have to live to be a human for only one day, and to have the hope of knowing the happiness of that glorious world above the stars. You must not think of that, said the old woman. we feel ourselves to be much happier and much better off than human beings. So, to recap, mermaids turn into sea foam when they die, much like vampires turning into dust, but humans get to discard their mortal coil and rise up beyond the stars. This is the last push for the Little Mermaid. Her destiny is calling, and she will get herself a soul, come hell or low water. And just like her garden full of red flowers, all the other mermaids think she's kind of odd for wanting one, because who wants to be like a human? The Little Mermaid is told that it's impossible to get a soul except for a particular legal loophole, in which if she marries a man, his soul will go into hers, and they'll share the same soul. So side tangent here, this is very reminiscent of the laws of coverture, which is an old and thankfully outmoded legal tradition in which a woman's legal identity was entirely covered and replaced by her husband's when they married. Shudder. Luckily for feminism, there's another workaround for the Little Mermaid getting a soul. More on that later. The Little Mermaid, for now, has just the man in mind, so she goes to the sea witch, trades her tongue for a potion that will give her legs, and heads to the surface. She has a prince to marry. What could possibly go wrong? Much like the Little Mermaid, Spike has always been a bit of an odd duck among vampires. At the end of season 2, he betrays Angelus and forms an unlikely alliance with Buffy because he doesn't want the world to end. "I want to save the world," he says dramatically. "I like this world. You've got dog racing, Manchester United, and you've got people. Happy meals with legs." He's still a poet at heart, and he romanticizes the good guys among the humans, even when he doesn't count himself as one of them. Like the Little Mermaid, exploring the canals and narrow waterways to get as close to human castles as possible, all the while risking discovery, Spike ventures beyond the traditional vampire haunts, even in daylight hours. He throws a jacket over his head and runs through the sunlight, even as his arms singe in flames. The suffering is worth having access to the surface world and the people that fascinate him. This is all before Spike has voiced that he is falling in love with Buffy. Like the Little Mermaid, however, it's his love for Buffy, and an act of violence towards her for which he must atone, that drives Spike to harness his draw to the human world and find a way to do the impossible, win back his soul. For the Little Mermaid, life among humans is a constant carousel of joy and suffering. She must allow the sea witch to cut off her tongue and may never speak or sing again. Growing legs from her tail will feel like a sword has passed through her. Every step she takes on her new human feet feels like stepping on sharp knives. All of this she bears. She also bears the knowledge that if the prince loves her fully, she will gain an immortal soul. But if he ever marries another, she will disintegrate into sea foam. As she dances gracefully on her bleeding feet and dutifully sleeps on a pillow outside the prince's door like a loyal pet, the Little Mermaid embodies the cult of suffering so common in Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales. Good and gentle characters suffer and suffer, not as punishment, but because they are gentle and sensitive souls who, born into the wrong body for their hearts, must go to great lengths to find their place in the world. See also The Ugly Duckling and Thumbelina as great examples of characters who must go on long journeys to either find the place they belong, like the Ugly Duckling, or to grow the body part they are missing, like Thumbelina meeting the fairies and growing her wings at last. Hans Christian Andersen, by all accounts, suffered emotionally through his life in ways that mirror those of his characters. He was romantically attracted to men. It is unclear if that love was ever requited or if he even died a virgin. Moreover, the way that Andersen writes about himself in his autobiography and letters, including his distress upon going through puberty and the way that he felt feminine in his voice and demeanor, has always struck me as sounding genderqueer or transgender. For example, he talks about just feeling so heartsick when he can no longer sing the soprano part when his voice changes. Andersen appears to have poured his own suffering into his characters, and in words attempted to make that suffering poetic and even beautiful. Did Andersen suffer from body dysmorphia? His characters certainly did, the Little Mermaid the chief example among them. And this is where the joy and the beauty come in, despite the suffering, despite the fact that the prince only loves her like a little child, and that it never comes into his head to make her his wife. The Little Mermaid loves being a human. She loves riding on horseback beside the prince through sweet scented woods and feeling tree boughs touch her shoulders. She loves climbing mountains, despite the intense pain in her feet and the bloody footprints she leaves behind. She loves to watch the clouds below them like a flock of birds. She knows what birds are now. She has achieved the human body and the human world that she always longed for. Despite physical suffering, she is where she belongs. This joy from making it to the world in which she belongs must be enough for the Little Mermaid. For though she earns the prince's affection and companionship, she will never have his romantic love. He may kiss her rosy mouth, play with her long waving hair, and lay his head upon her heart. But he insists that he could only ever love the mysterious woman who rescued him from drowning, never dreaming that it could be the Little Mermaid herself. In a cruel twist of fate, he meets the princess to whom he is betrothed, and concludes that this must be the woman who saved him. The princess is beautiful and kind, the prince falls in love, and the Little Mermaid's fate is sealed. "You will rejoice at my happiness," the prince tells her obliviously, not knowing she is doomed to die with the sunrise after his nuptials, "for your devotion to me is great and sincere." Spike's vampirehood is also marked by larger-than-life suffering, some of it self-imposed. Sure, there's a usual almost being killed by the Slayer while a building collapses on you that just about every big bad faces, but Spike manages to rack up a truly remarkable list of pains and indignities. The initiative installs a chip in his brain that causes him searing pain whenever he tries to hurt a human. Later in the series, he does it anyway, never mind the pain. He regularly runs through fire to visit the Scooby Gang. He is kidnapped and tortured by Glory, and it is only his firm belief that Buffy will save him that pulls him through, unbeknown to Buffy, who rescues him more or less as a side quest when she concludes that he hasn't actually given information to Glory that might endanger Dawn. His Season 6 relationship with Buffy is characterized by aggression and violence. His suffering is more frequent than that of the other big bads because he seeks connection to humans and to the human world. He is always flying too close to the sun. All of that pales in comparison to what Spike experiences post-ensoulment. "Angel didn't warn me," Spike says to Buffy in a stirring monologue, hinting to her at last that he has a soul while draping himself over a cross, allowing himself to smoke and burn. Angel almost certainly did tell him, and everyone around him, that having a soul meant constant remorse and suffering. For Angel, it has to, or he will literally lose his soul. The intense shame from his past leaves Spike vulnerable to the first evil's manipulations, as he appears to be losing his mind and his signature hairstyle. To avoid being triggered by the first, he has to subject himself to imprisonment by the Scooby Gang. At one point, he offers his chest to Buffy when he expects her to slay him to prevent him from killing under the first evil's influence. When captured by the first, he is tortured and bled to such an extent that even the Little Mermaid, with her ever-bleeding souls, would count her lucky stars to have escaped such a fate. Even unlocking the triggers in his mind that the first evil used to control him requires a cringe-inducing measure, a stone, enchanted to wriggle like a worm, that crawls through his eye socket and into his brain. "I've had to redefine suffering since I fell in love with you," Spike tells Buffy point blank. Unlike the Little Mermaid, some of the suffering is part of Spike seeking redemption, but much like the Little Mermaid, there is also joy in this newfound humanity, despite the suffering, and despite the dire circumstances of preparing for a war against the first evil. As Anya observes to Spike, his soul is beautiful. And in Buffy's night of exile, Spike comforts her and is invited back into her bed. Only in the literal sense, not the euphemistic one. Like the Little Mermaid, he lays his head upon her heart, and it is the best night of his life. The very next evening, he watches Buffy greet a prodigal angel with a kiss. The Little Mermaid is glum the day of the prince's wedding, knowing that, having pledged his heart to another, she will die at sunrise by disintegrating into sea foam. She has failed in her quest to earn an immortal soul, and she does not have the prince's love. Gazing out at the stars and the sea after the prince and his bride have gone to bed, the Little Mermaid sees her 6 sisters appear at the surface, bald and wielding a knife. They have traded their hair to the sea witch for this knife. If the Little Mermaid plunges the knife into the prince's heart and bathes her feet in his heart's blood, she will become a mermaid again and return to the sea for centuries of life. She briefly considers it, but she makes a choice about who she wants to be. Instead of saving her own life through sacrificing another, she gives the prince one last little forehead kiss and tosses the knife into the water just as the sun is rising. She throws herself into the sea, and for a moment she believes that her body is dissolving into sea foam. But instead, the warm rays of the sun fall on her cold form, and she does not feel as though she were dying. When she opens her eyes, she is among the daughters of the air. They explain to her that a mermaid has no soul, and can only earn one through the love of a human being. But a daughter of the air, on the other hand, although they do not possess an immortal soul, can, by their good deeds, procure one for themselves. The Little Mermaid, through her courage, her suffering, and her ultimate decision not to kill the prince, has earned herself the right to earn herself an immortal soul. By bringing soft breezes and the lovely smell of flowers on the wind to humanity for 300 years, she may finally earn a soul, and with it, access to heaven. Spike, too, dies the day after his beloved Buffy kisses Angel, though it is more of a coincidence than a cause and effect. Spike wears the amulet meant for a vampire with a soul, proud to be a champion. As his body starts to disintegrate due to the amulet's power in closing the hellmouth, he exclaims, "My soul! I can really feel it." When it becomes clear that the amulet will destroy him, Buffy urges him to go to safety. But Spike chooses to stay. Like the Little Mermaid, he willfully allows his body to perish in order to protect others. "I love you," Buffy tells him, words that would have earned the Little Mermaid a soul from her prince. But Spike doesn't believe it. "No, you don't," he says, "but thank you for saying so." His love for Buffy has been his North Star and catalyst in seeking a soul, but the business of having and keeping a soul, that is entirely separate from whether or not Buffy loves him back. Spike's journey in season 7 has been guided by his love for and devotion to Buffy, but he has not expected reciprocal love from her. He wants a soul and redemption regardless of whether Buffy ever loves or forgives him. As he told Buffy at the church, he did it to be the kind of man who would never, to be a kind of man. His real quest was his own humanity, regardless of Buffy's love. And so, as he allows his body to disintegrate into light in the hellmouth, he seems to feel a certain amount of peace. But, like the Little Mermaid, he does not die. Rather than awake among the daughters of the air, he comes to screaming in the office of his old rival, Angel, at Wolfram and Hart. He is only soul now, no body. He's more or less a ghost. He might as well be a spirit of the air. He will need to spend his time learning to do good deeds, even for people he isn't in love with. Sometimes that means accidentally knocking over some paperwork to reveal a vital clue to an investigation. Sometimes that means sacrificing his first opportunity to regain a body in order to save Fred from a ghost who is attempting to strangle her. But eventually, in far fewer than 300 years, Spike gets his body back. The narrative ends with little hope of Spike reuniting with Buffy, but we do see that his original quest to reconnect with humanity is well on its way. So in conclusion, the Little Mermaid and Spike both seek souls. They both suffer for them. Spike suffers in his soul. The Little Mermaid suffers from her sensitive soles of her feet. But despite that suffering, they have found purpose and joy in being in the places and the bodies that they were always meant for. They have perhaps faced down body dysmorphia, or at the very least soul dysmorphia, to do so. Love has spurred them on this quest, but their love must be great enough to withstand not being loved in return. Their quest for their souls is separate from the object of their love. As non-corporeal beings, they must enact small deeds of goodness for humanity, and in so doing, they must seize their own soulful destinies through their own actions. Thank you for joining me in my first ever podcast. Please, I would love to hear your thoughts and comments below. Share, and excited to be in conversation with you about fairy tales, folk tales, and all these stories that we love in the Buffyverse. Till next time.